The dusty streets of Redemption Creek stretched endlessly under the scorching Arizona sun, where danger lurked behind every weathered storefront, and salvation seemed as scarce as water in the desert. In this unforgiving frontier town of 1882, where justice was measured by the speed of a draw, and mercy was a luxury few could afford, lived a woman whose very existence had become a death sentence written by those who feared her truth. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from in the comments below. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the window of her modest boarding house room, her emerald eyes scanning the street below with the practiced wariness of someone who had learned that shadows could kill. At 26, she possessed a beauty that could stop conversations and a secret that could stop bullets. If the wrong people discovered what she truly knew about the railroad company's bloody dealings with the Apache tribes. Her auburn hair caught the morning light as she adjusted the lace curtains, a gesture so delicate it belied the Colt revolver hidden beneath her blue cotton dress. 3 months had passed since she'd witnessed the massacre at Devil's Canyon, where railroad executives had orchestrated the slaughter of peaceful Apache families to clear the land for their iron tracks. 3 months since she'd become the most hunted woman in the Arizona Territory, with a bounty on her head that grew larger with each passing week. The Pinkerton detectives, corrupt lawmen, and hired killers who stalked her weren't interested in justice. They wanted her silenced permanently, buried in the desert where her testimony could never reach a courtroom. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she touched the locket at her throat, containing the only photograph of her deceased parents and a small piece of paper with an address in San Francisco, her only hope of reaching someone who could help her expose the truth. But San Francisco might as well have been on the moon, considering the army of men who wanted her dead before she could make that journey. The boarding house where she'd taken refuge was run by Martha Henderson, a weathered widow whose husband had died building the very railroad that now sought Eleanor's blood. Martha's establishment catered to drifters, gamblers, and those seeking to disappear into the anonymity of the frontier, making it the perfect hiding place for a woman whose face had been sketched on wanted posters from Tucson to Denver. The other residents kept to themselves, understanding that in a place like Redemption Creek, curiosity could be fatal. Eleanor had arrived in town 3 weeks ago, her money running dangerously low and her options dwindling with each passing day. She'd changed her name twice, dyed her distinctive auburn hair a mousy brown, and adopted the mannerisms of a grieving widow seeking a fresh start. But despite her precautions, she could feel the net closing around her. Yesterday, she'd spotted a man in a black suit asking questions at the general store, his eyes too sharp and his interest too keen for a casual traveler. The sound of spurs on wooden planks made her heart race as heavy footsteps approached her door. She'd grown accustomed to the constant fear, the sleepless nights, and the knowledge that every sunrise might be her last. Her hand instinctively moved toward her hidden weapon as a gentle knock echoed through the small room. Too gentle for the killers who usually came calling, but in Redemption Creek, even kindness could be a trap. "Miss Whitmore?" The voice was deep, measured, carrying a strange mixture of authority and something she hadn't heard in months, genuine concern. "My name is Jake Morrison. I believe we need to talk." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. No one in Redemption Creek knew her real name. She'd been living as Mary Thompson, a widow from Kansas seeking work as a seamstress. The fact that this stranger knew her true identity meant only one thing: Her time had run out. With practiced efficiency, she drew her revolver and positioned herself beside the door, her back pressed against the wall. "I don't know anyone by that name," she called out, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You've got the wrong room, mister." A soft chuckle came from the other side of the door, but it wasn't the cruel laughter she'd expected from a bounty hunter. "Ma'am, I know you're scared, and you have every right to be, but I'm not here to hurt you. Judge Harrison in Santa Fe sent me. He received your letter." Eleanor's grip on the gun tightened. She had sent a letter to Judge Harrison 2 weeks ago, a desperate plea for help from the one honest lawman she'd heard about in the territory. But she'd used a false name and hadn't mentioned her location. How could this man possibly know? "Judge Harrison is dead," she replied, testing him. "Killed in a stagecoach robbery last month." "No, ma'am. He's very much alive, though he did survive an attempt on his life 3 weeks ago. 3 men tried to ambush his carriage outside Santa Fe, but his guards were ready for them. The judge has been expecting something like this ever since he started investigating the railroad's activities. That's why he sent me to find you." Eleanor felt a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed by years of disappointment and betrayal. "Even if that's true, how do I know you're not working for them? How do I know this isn't just another trap?" "Because if I was working for the railroad, you'd already be dead. I've been watching this place for 2 days, and I've counted at least 4 different men who've been asking questions about you. Real professionals, the kind who don't knock politely on doors. The kind who would have kicked this door down and put a bullet in you before you could draw that Colt you're holding." The accuracy of his observation sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. How long had he been watching her? And more importantly, if he could see through her disguise so easily, how long before the others did too? "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To keep you alive long enough to testify. Judge Harrison believes your testimony could bring down not just the local railroad bosses, but some very powerful men in Washington who've been turning a blind eye to what's happening out here. But first, we need to get you out of Redemption Creek, tonight." Eleanor closed her eyes, weighing her options. She could continue running, moving from town to town, until her money ran out or her luck failed. She could try to make it to San Francisco on her own, knowing that every mile would bring new dangers and that she'd likely be dead before she reached the California border. Or she could trust this stranger, this Jake Morrison, whose voice carried a sincerity she desperately wanted to believe in. "How do I know you're telling the truth about Judge Harrison?" she asked. "He told me to tell you that he remembers your father, Captain William Whitmore, from the war. They served together at Antietam, and the judge said your father saved his life by pulling him out of a burning barn. He said to tell you that he owes your family a debt, and he intends to pay it." Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. No one alive knew that story except Judge Harrison himself. Her father had mentioned it only once, in a letter he'd written to her mother during the war. The letter she'd found among her mother's belongings after the fever took her. The same letter she'd quoted in her desperate plea to the judge. Slowly, she lowered her weapon and approached the door, her hand hovering over the lock. "If you're lying to me, if this is some elaborate trick, then I'm the most patient bounty hunter in the territory, ma'am. And I'm also the stupidest, because I could have taken you any time in the last 2 days if that's what I wanted." Eleanor took a deep breath and turned the key, opening the door just wide enough to see the man on the other side. Jake Morrison was not what she'd expected. Tall and lean, with dark hair touched by premature gray at the temples, he wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy rather than the fancy suit of a Pinkerton detective. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that spoke of hard living and harder choices. But it was his eyes that convinced her, deep brown eyes that held no deception, no cruelty, only a quiet determination and something that looked almost like compassion. "Miss Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "we need to leave, now." Eleanor's world had just changed forever, though she didn't yet realize that the man standing before her would become far more than just her protector. In the dangerous days ahead, Jake Morrison would prove that some men were willing to die not for money or glory, but for something far more precious, the chance to see a good woman smile again. Eleanor stepped back, allowing Jake to enter her small room, though she kept her revolver within easy reach. The space felt even smaller with his presence filling it, and she found herself acutely aware of how close they were standing. He moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger, his eyes quickly cataloging every detail of the room, the packed saddlebags by the bed, the escape route through the window, the way she positioned herself to maintain multiple exit options. "You're already packed," he observed, a note of approval in his voice. "Good, that'll save us time." "I've been ready to run for weeks," Eleanor admitted, surprised by her own honesty. There was something about this man that made her want to trust him, despite every instinct screaming at her to remain guarded. "But I need to know more about you before I go anywhere. Judge Harrison may have sent you, but that doesn't tell me who you are or why you're willing to risk your life for a stranger." Jake's expression grew serious as he moved to the window, carefully peering through the curtains at the street below. "Name's Jake Morrison, like I said. I used to be a Texas Ranger before I went freelance. Judge Harrison and I have worked together before on cases involving corruption in territorial governments. As for why I'm here—" He paused, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see the railroad's dirty dealings exposed." Eleanor sensed there was more to his story, but before she could press in for details, Jake's posture suddenly tensed. "We've got company," he said quietly, his hand moving to the Colt at his hip. "3 men just rode up to the saloon across the street. They're trying to look casual, but they're watching this building." Eleanor's heart began to race as she joined him at the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. The 3 men Jake had spotted were dismounting from their horses with the deliberate movements of professionals. Even from a distance, she could see the telltale bulges of concealed weapons beneath their coats. "Pinkertons?" she whispered. "Worse. Private contractors. The kind of men who don't ask questions and don't leave witnesses." Jake's voice was grim as he assessed their situation. "The good news is they're being cautious, which means they're not entirely sure you're here. The bad news is that once they start asking questions, it won't take them long to figure it out." Eleanor felt the familiar surge of panic that had become her constant companion over the past 3 months. "What do we do?" "We leave. Now, but not the way they'll expect." Jake moved away from the window and began examining the room's layout with the practiced eye of someone who'd escaped from tight spots before. "Is there a back staircase?" "Yes, but it leads directly into the kitchen, where Martha spends most of her time. She's been kind to me, but I don't know if she can be trusted with something like this." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Then we go up instead of down. These old buildings usually have access to the roof through the attic. From there, we can make our way to the next building and come down several blocks away." As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, the sound of heavy boots on the front stairs of the boarding house echoed through the building. Eleanor grabbed her saddlebags while Jake quickly surveyed the ceiling, looking for access to the attic space above. "There," he said, pointing to a small trapdoor in the corner of the room. "Can you reach it?" Eleanor nodded, though her hands were shaking as she dragged a chair over to the spot. The voices in the hallway below were getting closer, and she could hear Martha's nervous chatter as she tried to answer questions about her guests. The older woman was clearly flustered, which would only make the men more suspicious. Jake boosted Eleanor up to the trapdoor, his strong hands steady on her waist as she pushed it open and pulled herself into the dusty attic space above. The area was cramped and filled with cobwebs, but it was better than facing the killers who were now climbing the stairs to the second floor. Jake handed up their bags before pulling himself through the opening with surprising agility for such a large man. He carefully replaced the trapdoor, just as they heard heavy footsteps in the hallway outside Eleanor's room. In the darkness of the attic, Eleanor found herself pressed close to Jake, their breathing synchronized as they listened to the sounds below. She could smell the leather of his vest, the faint scent of sage and gunpowder that seemed to cling to him, and something else, something clean and masculine, that made her acutely aware of how long it had been since she'd been this close to a man who wasn't trying to kill her. A loud bang echoed through the building as the men kicked in her door, followed by angry voices and the sound of furniture being overturned. Eleanor bit her lip to keep from crying out, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Jake's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that was both comforting and surprisingly intimate. "Easy," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "They'll search the room and move on. We just need to wait them out." But Eleanor could barely concentrate on his words. The simple touch of his hand had sent an unexpected warmth through her body, a feeling she hadn't experienced since before her world had turned upside down. For months, she'd been focused solely on survival, on staying one step ahead of the men who wanted her dead. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched with gentleness instead of violence, to have someone offer comfort instead of threats. The voices below grew more agitated as the men realized their quarry had escaped. Eleanor could hear them questioning Martha more aggressively, and she felt a stab of guilt for bringing danger to the kind woman who had given her shelter. "She's not here," one of the men was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the thin floorboards. "But her things are gone, which means she knew we were coming. Someone tipped her off." "Check the other rooms," another voice commanded, "and send Rodriguez to watch the back exit. If she's still in this building, we'll find her." Jake squeezed Eleanor's hand reassuringly, then began moving carefully through the attic space, testing the floorboards to avoid any that might creak and give away their position. Eleanor followed, trying to match his careful movements, despite the awkwardness of navigating in near total darkness while carrying her saddlebags. They made their way toward the far end of the building, where Jake had spotted what looked like another access point that would allow them to reach the roof of the adjacent structure. The sounds of the search continued below them, growing more distant as they moved away from Eleanor's former room. "Here," Jake whispered, pointing to a small window that opened onto the roof of the neighboring building. "It's going to be a tight squeeze, but it's our best option." Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure he could see her in the darkness. The window was indeed small, barely large enough for a person to fit through, and the drop to the next roof looked treacherous in the dim light filtering through the grimy glass. Jake went first, somehow managing to maneuver his large frame through the opening with minimal noise. He then reached back to help Eleanor, his strong hands guiding her safely through the window and onto the slanted roof beyond. The night air was cool against her skin after the stifling heat of the attic, and Eleanor took a moment to catch her breath while Jake surveyed their surroundings. The roof they were on belonged to the town's general store, and from their vantage point, they could see the three men's horses still tied up outside the saloon across the street. "We need to get to the livery stable," Jake said quietly. "I've got horses waiting there, and once we're mounted, we can be out of town before they realize we've slipped through their fingers." Eleanor looked down at the street below, calculating the distance they'd need to cover to reach the stable without being seen. It seemed impossible, but she'd learned that impossible was often the only option available to her these days. "Lead the way," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. As they began their careful descent from roof to roof, moving through the shadows like ghosts in the night, Eleanor found herself stealing glances at the man who had appeared so suddenly in her life. Jake Morrison moved with the confidence of someone who had faced danger countless times before. But there was something else about him, a gentleness in the way he helped her navigate the treacherous path, a protectiveness that went beyond mere professional duty. For the first time in months, Eleanor allowed herself to hope that she might actually survive long enough to see justice done. But more than that, she found herself wondering about the man who had risked his life to save hers, and what secrets lay hidden behind those compassionate brown eyes. The night was far from over, and the dangers they faced were only beginning. But as they made their way through the darkness toward an uncertain future, Eleanor realized that she was no longer facing those dangers alone. And for a woman who had spent months believing that death was her only companion, that realization was more precious than all the gold in the Arizona Territory. The livery stable sat at the edge of Redemption Creek like a weathered sentinel, its wooden walls scarred by years of desert winds and scorching sun. Jake led Eleanor through a maze of back alleys and abandoned lots, their footsteps muffled by the sand that seemed to coat everything in this God-forsaken town. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that provided perfect cover for their escape, but also concealed potential threats lurking in every doorway. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as they approached the stable's rear entrance. Behind them, she could still hear the distant sounds of the search, men calling to each other, doors slamming, the general commotion of predators who had lost their prey. The three contractors weren't the only ones hunting her. She'd learned to recognize the signs of a coordinated effort, and tonight felt different, more urgent than the previous attempts on her life. "Wait here," Jake whispered, pressing her back against the stable wall while he peered around the corner. His body was tense, coiled like a spring, ready to unleash violence if necessary. Eleanor found herself studying his profile in the moonlight, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his eyes never stopped moving, constantly assessing threats and escape routes. After what felt like an eternity, Jake motioned for her to follow him into the stable. The interior was thick with the familiar sense of hay, leather, and horses, but Eleanor's relief at reaching their destination was short-lived. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could make out the silhouettes of several horses in their stalls, but something felt wrong. "Jake," she whispered urgently, but he was already moving, his hand on his gun as he approached the stall where he'd apparently left their mounts. The stall was empty. "Son of a bitch," Jake muttered under his breath, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and concern that made Eleanor's stomach clench with fear. Someone knew we were coming. Before Eleanor could respond, the stable door behind them creaked open, and a familiar voice cut through the darkness. "Well, well, Jake Morrison, I should have known you'd turn up eventually." Eleanor spun around, to see a tall, thin man silhouetted in the doorway, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. Even in the dim light, she could see the cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth, and the way his eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Hello, Crenshaw," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the obvious tension in his posture. "Still taking money from railroad barons, I see?" The man called Crenshaw chuckled, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. "Money's money, Morrison, and there's a lot of it riding on making sure Miss Whitmore here doesn't make it to Santa Fe alive." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she realized they'd walked directly into a trap. Crenshaw wasn't alone. She could see at least two other figures moving in the shadows behind him, and probably more positioned outside the stable. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of options. "Let her go, Crenshaw," Jake said, taking a step forward that put him between Eleanor and the gunman. "Your quarrel is with me, not her." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong," Crenshaw replied, his smile widening. "You see, Miss Whitmore has become quite the valuable commodity. The railroad executives are very eager to have a conversation with her about what she thinks she saw at Devil's Canyon. And they're willing to pay handsomely to ensure that conversation happens on their terms." Eleanor's mind raced as she tried to process what she was hearing. They didn't just want her dead. They wanted her alive, at least long enough to find out what evidence she might have hidden away. The realization sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "The thing is," Crenshaw continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than outright threats, "we've been watching you for weeks, Morrison. We know about your little arrangement with Judge Harrison, and we know about your personal interest in keeping Miss Whitmore breathing." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond to the taunt. Eleanor could see the muscles in his shoulders bunching beneath his shirt, and she knew he was calculating their chances of fighting their way out of this situation. The odds didn't look good. "You always were too sentimental for this line of work," Crenshaw said, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Remember that job in El Paso? You could have made a fortune if you hadn't developed a conscience at the last minute." "Some things are worth more than money," Jake replied quietly, and Eleanor felt something shift in the air between them, a tension that went beyond the immediate danger they were facing. Crenshaw's expression hardened. "Well, your conscience is about to get you both killed. Boys, take them." The next few seconds unfolded like a deadly dance, choreographed by violence and desperation. Jake drew his gun with lightning speed, his first shot taking down one of Crenshaw's men before the man could clear leather. Eleanor threw herself behind a pile of hay bales as bullets began flying, the confined space of the stable amplifying the thunderous reports of the gunfire. Jake moved with the fluid grace of a man who had survived countless gunfights, using the stable's support posts and horse stalls for cover as he returned fire. But Eleanor could see that they were hopelessly outnumbered, and it was only a matter of time before Crenshaw's men overwhelmed them through sheer force of numbers. That's when she remembered the small derringer hidden in her boot, a last resort weapon she'd hoped never to use. As Jake engaged two men near the front of the stable, Eleanor saw Crenshaw moving to flank him, his gun trained on Jake's back. Without thinking, Eleanor rose from her hiding place and fired, the small pistol bucking in her hand as the bullet caught Crenshaw in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his shot wide. The gunman's cry of pain and surprise gave Jake the opening he needed to finish the fight, his final shots echoing through the stable before an eerie silence descended. Eleanor's ears were ringing from the gunfire, and the acrid smell of gunpowder burned her nostrils as she slowly emerged from behind the hay bales. Jake was standing over Crenshaw's fallen form, his smoking gun still in his hand, but his eyes were fixed on Eleanor, with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Are you hurt?" he asked, holstering his weapon and moving toward her with quick, concerned strides. Eleanor shook her head, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold on to the derringer, and she felt as though she might collapse at any moment. The reality of what had just happened, the violence, the blood, the fact that she had shot a man, was beginning to sink in. "Hey," Jake said softly, gently taking the small pistol from her trembling fingers and pulling her into his arms. "It's okay. You did what you had to do. You saved my life." Eleanor found herself pressed against Jake's chest, his strong arms wrapped around her as she struggled to process the events of the last few minutes. She could feel his heart beating rapidly beneath her cheek, could smell the familiar sense of leather and gunpowder that seemed to follow him everywhere. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in the safety of his embrace, to pretend that the world outside this stable didn't exist. But reality intruded all too quickly. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, though he made no immediate move to release her. "That gunfire will have attracted attention, and there are probably more of them on the way." Eleanor nodded against his chest, reluctantly pulling away from the comfort he offered. "What about the horses?" Jake's expression was grim as he surveyed the empty stalls. "Crenshaw's men must have moved them, but I've got a backup plan. There's an old mine shaft about 2 miles north of town where I've got supplies cached. We can hole up there until morning, then figure out our next move." As they prepared to leave the stable, Eleanor caught sight of Crenshaw's body sprawled near the entrance. The man who had seemed so confident and menacing just minutes before now looked small and pathetic in death, his cruel smile replaced by the vacant stare of the departed. "Don't walk," Jake said gently, guiding her toward the back exit. He made his choice when he decided to hunt innocent people for money. But Eleanor couldn't shake the image from her mind as they slipped out into the night. She had killed a man tonight, had taken a life to save another. The weight of that action settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket, and she wondered if she would ever be able to forget the sound of her derringer firing, or the look of surprise on Crenshaw's face as her bullet found its mark. Jake seemed to sense her inner turmoil as they made their way through the darkness toward the abandoned mine. "The first time is always the hardest," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But you did the right thing, Eleanor. That man would have killed me without hesitation, and then he would have done things to you that don't bear thinking about." Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure she entirely believed him. The line between right and wrong had become increasingly blurred over the past few months, and tonight had pushed her even further into a gray area she'd never imagined she would inhabit. As they walked through the desert night, the lights of Redemption Creek growing smaller behind them, Eleanor found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. Jake Morrison had risked his life to save hers, had fought off multiple attackers to keep her safe, and had shown her a gentleness she hadn't experienced in months. But there were still so many questions about him, so many secrets hidden behind those compassionate brown eyes. Who was he really? What was his connection to Crenshaw? And what had happened in El Paso that had apparently changed the course of his life? And perhaps most importantly, why was he willing to risk everything for a woman he barely knew? The abandoned mine loomed ahead of them in the darkness, its entrance yawning like a mouth ready to swallow them whole. Eleanor shivered, though whether from the cool night air or from apprehension about what the morning might bring, she couldn't say. One thing was certain. Her life had changed irrevocably tonight. She was no longer just a woman running from her past. She was someone who had killed to protect the man who was trying to save her. And as they disappeared into the depths of the mine, Eleanor realized that she was beginning to care about Jake Morrison in ways that went far beyond mere gratitude. In the dangerous game they were playing, such feelings could be a liability. But as Jake's hand found hers in the darkness of the mine shaft, Eleanor discovered that some risks were worth taking, even when the stakes were life and death. The abandoned copper mine stretched into the earth like the throat of some ancient beast, its walls scarred by years of pickaxes and dynamite. Jake led Eleanor deeper into the tunnel system, his steps sure and confident, despite the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. The air grew cooler as they descended, carrying the metallic taste of old ore and the musty scent of abandonment. "How do you know about this place?" Eleanor asked, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. She stayed close behind Jake, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall for guidance, while the other maintained a grip on her saddlebags. "I've been using it as a supply cache for the better part of a year," Jake replied, his voice low and reassuring in the darkness. "When you're hunting corrupt officials and railroad barons, it pays to have bolt holes scattered across the territory. This particular mine has been abandoned for 5 years, ever since the copper vein played out." They rounded a bend in the tunnel, and Eleanor was surprised to see a faint glow emanating from somewhere ahead. As they drew closer, she could make out the warm flicker of lamplight dancing on the stone walls, and she realized that Jake had prepared this refuge far more thoroughly than she'd imagined. The chamber they entered was larger than Eleanor had expected, with several branching tunnels leading off into the depths of the mine. Jake had transformed the space into a surprisingly comfortable hideout, complete with bedrolls, supplies, and even a small camp stove that provided both warmth and the means to prepare hot food. "Welcome to my home away from home," Jake said with a wry smile, setting down his gear and moving to light additional lamps around the chamber. "It's not much, but it's safe, and it's well-stocked enough to keep us comfortable for several days if necessary." Eleanor looked around the space with growing amazement. There were crates of supplies stacked against the walls, weapons and ammunition stored in waterproof containers, and even a small library of books and maps. This wasn't just a temporary hideout. It was a carefully planned and well-maintained base of operations. "You've been planning this for a long time," she observed, setting down her own bags and moving closer to the warmth of the camp stove. Jake nodded, his expression growing serious as he began checking his weapons and reloading the chambers he'd emptied during the gunfight at the stable. "Judge Harrison and I have been investigating railroad corruption for over 2 years. We knew that eventually we'd need to go up against some very powerful and very dangerous people. Places like this are insurance policies, somewhere to regroup when things go bad." Eleanor settled onto one of the bedrolls, finally allowing herself to relax for the first time since Jake had knocked on her door. The events of the evening felt surreal now, like something from a dime novel rather than her actual life. Just hours ago, she'd been hiding in a boarding house room, and now she was sitting in an abandoned mine with a man who seemed to have stepped out of her dreams. "Tell me about Crenshaw," she said, watching Jake's face carefully. "You two knew each other." Jake's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regrets and painful memories. "Thomas Crenshaw and I used to work together, back when I was still taking jobs for whoever paid the most. We were partners for about 3 years, and I thought I knew him. Thought he had some kind of code, some line he wouldn't cross. Jake's hands stilled on his gun as he stared into the flames of the camp stove. I was wrong. Eleanor waited, sensing that there was more to the story. Jake seemed to be wrestling with himself, deciding how much to reveal about his past. The job in El Paso that Crenshaw mentioned, Jake continued finally. It was supposed to be simple. A wealthy rancher wanted us to track down some cattle rustlers who'd been hitting his herds. Good money, legitimate work. Or so I thought. What really happened? Jake's expression darkened. The cattle rustlers turned out to be a family of Mexican farmers who'd been grazing their small herd on land they'd owned for generations. The rancher wanted them gone so he could expand his operation, and he was willing to pay us to make sure they disappeared permanently. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air of the mine. What did you do? I walked away, told Crenshaw the job was off, that I wouldn't be part of murdering innocent people for land grabs. Jake's voice was quiet, but Eleanor could hear the pain beneath his words. Crenshaw saw things differently. He said money was money, and that sentiment was a luxury we couldn't afford in our line of work. He killed them anyway, Eleanor said, though it wasn't really a question. Jake nodded grimly. The whole family, parents, grandparents, 3 children, made it look like a raid by Apache warriors, complete with arrows and war paint. Collected his fee and moved on to the next job like nothing had happened. Eleanor felt sick to her stomach as she imagined the scene Jake was describing. The casual brutality of it, the calculated cruelty, made her think of the massacre at Devil's Canyon and the men who were now hunting her with the same cold efficiency. "That's when you became a Texas Ranger?" she asked. "Eventually. First, I spent about 6 months drinking myself to death in various saloons across Texas and New Mexico. Kept thinking about those children, about how I could have stopped it if I'd been stronger, smarter, better." Jake's hands resumed their methodical cleaning of his weapons, the familiar motions seeming to calm him. "Judge Harrison found me in a dive bar in Amarillo, 3 sheets to the wind and looking for a fight. He offered me a chance to make amends, to use my skills for something worthwhile, instead of just lining my pockets." Eleanor studied Jake's profile in the lamplight, seeing him with new understanding. The gentleness she'd sensed in him, the protective instinct that had driven him to risk his life for hers, made perfect sense now. He was a man trying to atone for past mistakes, seeking redemption through service to others. "Is that why you came for me?" she asked softly. "To make amends for what happened in El Paso?" Jake looked up from his weapons, his brown eyes meeting hers across the small space. "Partly," he admitted, "but not entirely." There was something in his expression that made Eleanor's heart skip a beat, an intensity that went beyond professional duty or personal guilt. She found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the magnetic pull of his gaze. "What's the other part?" she whispered. Jake set aside his gun and moved closer to her, his movements slow and deliberate. "The other part is that from the moment I saw you standing at that window in the boarding house, looking so brave and so scared at the same time, I knew I'd do whatever it took to keep you safe. Not because Judge Harrison asked me to, not because I owe a debt to your father's memory, but because—" Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as Jake's words washed over her. For months, she'd been running, hiding, existing in a state of constant fear and desperation. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as something other than a target, to be valued for who she was, rather than what she knew. "Jake," she whispered, reaching out to touch his face. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, feeling the roughness of day-old stubble and the warmth of his skin. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly as if savoring the simple contact. When he opened them again, Eleanor saw her own longing reflected in their depths. "I know this is crazy," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we barely know each other, and I know the timing couldn't be worse. But Eleanor, I need you to know that what I feel for you goes beyond duty or obligation. You've awakened something in me that I thought was dead and buried." Eleanor's heart was racing as she processed his confession. Part of her wanted to pull away, to maintain the emotional distance that had kept her alive for the past 3 months. But a larger part of her, the part that had been starved for human connection and genuine affection, yearned to close the gap between them. "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "I've been so focused on survival that I forgot what it meant to truly live. But when you look at me, when you touch me, I remember what it feels like to be more than just a woman running from death." Jake's hand covered hers where it rested against his cheek, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that was both tender and possessive. "Then let me give you something to live for," he said softly. "Let me show you that there's still beauty in this world, still reasons to hope for tomorrow." Eleanor felt herself drowning in the intensity of his gaze, in the promise of something she'd thought was lost to her forever. The rational part of her mind whispered warnings about the dangers of emotional attachment, about the risks of caring for someone when death lurked around every corner. But her heart had already made its choice. "Yes," she whispered. The single word carrying the weight of surrender and acceptance. Jake's lips found hers in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative and questioning. But as Eleanor responded, pressing closer to him and deepening the contact, the kiss became something more urgent, more desperate. It was the kiss of two people who had found each other in the darkness, who had discovered hope in the most unlikely of circumstances. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Eleanor rested her forehead against Jake's, their faces so close she could feel his breath on her skin. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said softly, "whatever dangers we face, I want you to know that you've already saved me in ways that have nothing to do with bullets or bounty hunters." Jake's arms tightened around her, pulling her closer until she was nestled against his chest. "And you've saved me too," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You've given me something worth fighting for, something worth dying for." As they held each other in the flickering lamplight of the abandoned mine, Eleanor felt a peace she hadn't experienced in months. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, and the ever-present threat of the men who wanted her dead. But tonight, in the arms of a man who had risked everything to protect her, she allowed herself to believe that love could triumph over fear, that hope could overcome despair. The mine shaft stretched into darkness around them, but Eleanor no longer felt afraid of the shadows. With Jake beside her, she was ready to face whatever the dawn might bring, secure in the knowledge that she was no longer alone in her fight for justice and survival. Their love story was just beginning, forged in violence and tempered by danger, but stronger for having survived the crucible of their shared ordeal. And as sleep finally claimed them, wrapped in each other's arms, Eleanor dreamed not of death and pursuit, but of a future where she and Jake could build something beautiful together, something worth all the risks they were taking. Dawn crept into the mine shaft like a hesitant visitor. its pale fingers of light barely penetrating the depths where Eleanor and Jake had spent the night. Eleanor woke slowly, her body stiff from sleeping on the hard ground, but warmed by Jake's presence beside her. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in the peaceful cocoon of his arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and feeling safer than she had in months. But reality intruded all too quickly as the events of the previous night came flooding back. The gunfight at the stable, Crenshaw's death, the desperate flight through the darkness. It all felt like a nightmare, except for the very real presence of the man who had saved her life. Jake stirred beside her, his eyes opening to meet hers with an alertness that spoke of years spent sleeping with one ear open for danger. "Morning," he said softly, his voice rough with sleep, but his gaze tender as it traced her features in the dim light. "Good morning," Eleanor replied, surprised by how natural it felt to wake up beside him. Despite everything they'd been through, despite the danger that still surrounded them, she felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since before her world had been turned upside down. Jake sat up slowly, his hand never leaving her shoulder, as he listened for any sounds that might indicate they'd been discovered during the night. The mine remained silent, except for the distant drip of water somewhere in the depths and the soft whisper of air moving through the tunnels. "We need to move soon," Jake said, though his tone suggested he was as reluctant to leave their sanctuary as she was. Crenshaw's death will have stirred up a hornet's nest, and it won't take them long to figure out where we've gone. Eleanor nodded, though the thought of venturing back into the world above filled her with dread. Here in the mine, wrapped in Jake's arms, she could almost pretend that the railroad executives and their hired killers didn't exist. But she knew that safety was an illusion, and that every moment they delayed increased the chances of being discovered. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, sitting up and beginning to gather her scattered belongings. Jake was already moving with the efficient motions of a man accustomed to breaking camp quickly. "Judge Harrison is expecting us in Santa Fe, but the direct route will be crawling with men looking for us. We'll have to take the long way around, through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. It'll add several days to our journey, but it's our best chance of avoiding the search parties." Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety at the mention of the mountains. She'd heard stories of travelers who'd ventured into those peaks and never returned, victims of everything from Apache war parties to sudden blizzards that could bury a person in minutes. "Is it safe?" she asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. Nothing about their situation was safe, and the mountains couldn't possibly be more dangerous than the army of killers hunting them. Jake's expression was grim as he checked his weapons and supplies. "Safer than staying on the main roads. The railroad has enough men on their payroll to watch every town and way station between here and Santa Fe. In the mountains, we'll only have to worry about the weather, wild animals, and the occasional outlaw band." "You make it sound so appealing," Eleanor said with a weak attempt at humor. Jake's face softened as he caught the fear underlying her words. He moved to her side, taking her hands in his and looking directly into her eyes. "Eleanor, I won't lie to you. The journey ahead is going to be difficult and dangerous. But I promise you this, I will get you to Santa Fe alive. No matter what it takes, I will die before I let anyone hurt you." The intensity in his voice, the absolute conviction in his eyes, sent a shiver through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the cool air of the mine. She believed him completely, and that belief gave her the strength to push aside her fears and focus on what needed to be done. "I trust you," she said simply, and saw something shift in Jake's expression, a mixture of gratitude and determination that made her heart skip a beat. They finished packing in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the challenges ahead. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at Jake as he worked, marveling at the way he moved with such confidence and purpose. This was a man who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious, and she drew strength from his calm competence. As they prepared to leave the mine, Jake handed Eleanor a rifle from his cache of weapons. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked. Eleanor examined the weapon, testing its weight and balance. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. He said a woman on the frontier needed to be able to protect herself." "Smart man," Jake said approvingly. "This is a Winchester repeater, 15 shots without reloading. Keep it close, and don't hesitate to use it if you have to." Eleanor nodded, slinging the rifle across her shoulder alongside her saddlebags. The weight of it was both comforting and sobering, a reminder that their journey would likely involve more violence before it was over. They emerged from the mine into the harsh light of the desert morning, both squinting as their eyes adjusted to the brightness. The landscape around them was stark and unforgiving, all red rock and scrub brush stretching to the horizon. In the distance, Eleanor could see the purple silhouettes of the mountains they would need to cross, looking impossibly far away and forbiddingly steep. Jake had hidden 2 horses in a box canyon about a mile from the mine entrance, along with enough supplies to last them several days. The animals were sturdy mountain ponies, bred for endurance rather than speed, and Eleanor felt a surge of relief at the sight of them. Walking to Santa Fe would have been a death sentence. "Meet Thunder and Lightning," Jake said with a slight smile as he began saddling the horses. "Not the most original names, I'll admit, but they've carried me through some tight spots over the years." Eleanor approached the horse Jake indicated would be hers, a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. "Hello, Lightning," she said softly, stroking the animal's neck. "I hope you're ready for an adventure." As they mounted up and began their journey toward the mountains, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. Behind them lay the familiar dangers of the desert and the men who hunted her. Ahead lay unknown perils and the promise of justice, if they could survive long enough to reach it. But beside her rode Jake Morrison, the man who had already proven he would risk everything to keep her safe. And as they urged their horses into a steady lope across the desert floor, Eleanor found herself thinking not about the dangers ahead, but about the possibilities that lay beyond them. For the first time since witnessing the massacre at Devil's Canyon, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't involve running and hiding. A future where she could testify against the railroad executives, see justice done for the innocent people who had died, and perhaps, if she was very lucky, build a life with the man who had shown her that love could bloom even in the darkest of circumstances. The sun climbed higher in the sky as they rode, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Behind them, a dust cloud on the horizon suggested that their pursuers had already picked up their trail. But Eleanor no longer felt the paralyzing fear that had been her constant companion for months. She had Jake beside her, weapons to defend herself, and a destination that promised an end to her long nightmare. Whatever lay ahead in the mountains, whatever dangers they would face in the days to come, she was ready to meet them head-on. The woman who had cowered in boarding house rooms and jumped at every shadow was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had found the courage to fight back. And as they rode toward the distant peaks, Eleanor Whitmore smiled for the first time in months, secure in the knowledge that she was no longer just a victim running from her fate. She was a woman with something to live for, something to fight for, and someone worth dying for riding beside her. And that, she realized, made all the difference in the world. The mountains loomed larger with each passing mile, their snow-capped peaks gleaming like beacons of hope against the azure sky. Eleanor urged Lightning forward, matching Jake's pace as they left the desert behind and began their ascent into a landscape that would test every ounce of their courage and determination. But she was no longer afraid. With Jake's love as her armor and justice as her goal, Eleanor Whitmore was ready to face whatever the mountains might throw at them. The final chapter of her ordeal was about to begin, and she intended to write it on her own terms.